So this afternoon, we're going to talk about participants in the meeting for business. And most of you were here this morning for Kathleen's marvelous presentation about clerking. And there's, of course, very little space between what the topics that she was talking about and the ones that we'll talk about this afternoon. I'm going to introduce myself and tell you that I've done a lot of observing and practicing being part of Quaker business practice. I've been a friend for 51 years and started serving on committees in year one. And over the years, I've clerked committees and I've clerked the meeting and I've served on PYM and FGC committees and clerked PYM and FGC committees and served and clerk on Quaker boards and been staff to Quaker boards. I've seen a lot. And I've looked over this group of people, and it looks to me like a group of people who have also seen a lot. The second thing I want you to know is that I, like you, am still learning about the complexities of Quaker business process and its beauty when it's flowing. I expect to learn more today. The third thing I want to tell you is an observation that usually, you know, that magic that you read about how Quakers, they'll be disagreeing and then they'll settle and a third way will open and there's a resolution and everybody lives happily ever after. The only times I've really seen that happen is when the discussion was so difficult and friends had such deep differences that we couldn't hide anymore. We had to be honest with one another, sometimes a little brutal. And then we come together. So there was some conversation this morning about conflict in the meeting. And my experience is we don't come to that magic until we really have to. So the participants in the meeting, that's the group of disparate individuals that you see in front of you when you're clerking. We do a lot of training for how to clerk, but a limited amount of training on how to be a member of the body of the meeting. In my observation, a skillful, seasoned, grounded body can support and lift up a so-so clerk. But the most gifted and skilled and grounded clerk has a tough time with an ungrounded body. So I'm curious, I'm just going to ask you to wave your hand, not the electronic thing, but just lift your hand if you have been in some kind of training session on how to be a participant in Meeting for Business. So how many of us have been in such a training? I'm flipping through the pages here. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for that part. I'm disappointed to hear it. And then how many of you, same thing, raise your hand. How many of you hope that when you're clerking, you have a good, solid, seasoned body to hold you while you're doing that? So there's a bit of a gap here. So this afternoon, we're going to talk about how to close that gap. So Zachary sent out a couple of pages of readings of my point of view about being a participant in a meeting for business. And because we only have a couple of hours together, I'm not going to sit here and lecture to you about the brilliance of my words. Instead, don't laugh at me, Joan Broadfield, I saw that. Instead, because you are mostly an experienced group, we're going to divide you into small groups to address the questions that came with that homework assignment. What, if anything, do you find particularly helpful? What, if anything, do you disagree with or find problematic or obscure? What do you think would be easiest for the friends in your meeting to practice, or your committee or your board or whatever it is you're the clerk of? And what do you think will be most difficult? So it's now 10 after. Let me say, if you didn't do the homework, you don't have to confess, because there will be other people in your group who go say enough that you can kind of be part of the conversation. If you want to have the document in front of you, if you go to the chat at the very, very top, there's a link. What does that link say? I've forgotten. I used to know what it says.
I'm going to have to
Go
put
up
it
there.
back in. Not everyone will.
Oh, not everyone will have it. Okay. If you click on that link, it will give you a PDF that you can open that will have the document if you want to have it in front of you as we proceed. All right, friends, are we ready? Are there any questions or comments before we move into the small groups? Okay, Zachary, move us along. So, from the readings or elsewhere, let's just start out with 2 or 3 things that we think are essential elements to being a good participant in meeting for worship. So it's hard with a big group like this, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to call on people from each page. I'm going to call on a person. So, or oh no, I'll use the magic. Do you all know how to do the raise your hand thing? So raise your hand and tell me something you think is an essential point that participants should know. Margaret?
We were just discussing this in the group about the preparation, both mentally, spiritually, and for actual facts that you need to bring to help the discussion move forward.
Thank you. Jane?
Well, I was just going to say that you should always read all the materials before you come.
Thank you, Jane. Elaine?
For the way we're doing things now, practically, I think it's worth getting familiar, comfortable with the technology, and to reach out if you need help, because there's somebody in your group who's been doing this. There's somebody in your group that knows, and they're probably very happy to help if they know you need the help.
Thanks. Joan?
Believe that what you're wondering about is something that others are wondering about, and in a manner that shows your openness to trust, to ask the question, to be a juicy face and not just a sullen face, I guess. Engage.
How many times? Yeah. How many times has it happened for us that you ask what you think is the stupid question, and then after the meeting, somebody comes up and says, "I'm so glad you asked that question. I didn't want to ask that question." Jody?
One thing that I think we all need to remind ourselves about all the time is that when you say what you need to say in the meeting for business, you let it go, it isn't yours anymore. And I think it's actively resisted sometimes, but I think it's really important.
It's not only actively resisted, but it's countercultural, because in many places the norm is that you keep making your point and making more points to reinforce your point until you finally talk everybody into your position. So it's countercultural to do that differently in meeting for business. Jan?
Before you
Are
move
we-
forward, can you say a little bit more about what it means to say your point and let it go before we go on to Jan? It's so important, but it's hard as a clerk to know how to communicate that.
Thank you, Dana. Well, it was recently called to my attention a Pendle Hill pamphlet that I have not read called An Atheist's Guide to Quaker Process. And point number one is give up before you start. And I think that the idea there is that your opinion isn't the thing. It's an element. It's one of the puzzle pieces. You put it out there, and then you see where other people put it, without defending it, and see how the spirit works with it. We'll talk about that more, I'm pretty sure. So stay tuned. David?
I was just going to say that come to the meeting with a mindset to support the clerk and to everyone support getting to help the clerk come to a sense of meeting.
Okay, we're going to take just a couple of more. Gwen? You there, Gwen?
Gwen is muted.
That when a topic comes up and you very quickly want to say your opinion, to also remind yourself that the real thing is to be listening with a very open mind to what other people say. Not listening for what you think you're going to hear, or do they agree with you or do they not agree with you?
That's another part of not defending your position, is that
Right.
you're busy. You're
Right.
busy listening and trying to hear more than the person is saying. Bianca?
To be compassionate with oneself in the process of discernment.
Yeah. So now I'd like to move to a different part of the response, which is, what in your experience, this is not a beat up on my meeting moment, but what in your experience are the areas where it gets really difficult for members of your meeting, things that they don't quite get, or don't do as well as you would hope for? So what do you find to be the hardest spots? Gwen, do you have your hand up again, or did I just fail to take it down?
All the hands still seem to be up, still from before.
Okay, I don't think Carol Smith had her hand up before. Carol, what's hard in your meeting?
We have a lot of business, and we can often have very large business packets, which people don't read. And so preparation in that sense can be poor. And the current leadership is working to try to meet that halfway and have some ways to summarize the information so that people have some better access to it.
Thanks. Jillian?
One of the areas that we have had recently most difficulty, and I think has had a lot of difficulty in the past, and I think Phil brought this up, is actually the use of our meeting house. We have a very old meeting house. We do not have the internet, and I can see that coming up. I have to bring that onto the agenda as it keeps coming up. And should we have it? Shouldn't we have it? What does that involve? But just closing the meeting house last 2 years ago nearly ripped us apart. Two people in particular, if they couldn't meet in the meeting house, there was no meeting. They just couldn't get round needing to go. We were using the phone. Because we don't have internet at the meeting house, we had to use the phone. But you asked for difficult topics, how we use the meeting house, any alterations we want to make. Woo, don't really want to go there, but it keeps coming up.
Let's just stipulate that I know of nothing that Quakers fight over more than changes to their meeting house. And we might touch on that, although we're mainly today focusing on the process. And many of these process questions can be applied to almost any content. Mercy? Oops. Mercy, are you there? I just accidentally.
Yes, I'm here. I'm here.
Okay,
I
go
put
ahead.
my hand down because I wasn't sure. You seem to be wrapping up, but I was very impressed with my small foursome meeting. No, I think there were 6 of us, but the point was raised that the leader has to know when to lead and when to follow. And the participants also have to know that. And I think it has to be clear that that is the process. This is not a triangle. I found that.
I think I accidentally took down a hand that was up. So whoever that was, if you want to put your hand back up, please do. Amy?
Yeah. Hi, friends. I was wondering if at some point we could share, and this is kind of a tricky one, but when meetings have kind of like a shadow group that's maybe been around a long time, has been the families that have been in a meeting a long time, people that have been there a long time, that kind of maybe decide on things outside of meeting for worship for business, or maybe don't show the amount of respect to the container that's created for different voices, or the clerk trying to manage those things. Do folks have like hints and tips of how to how to maintain that quality of spiritual trust and togetherness when some folks probably don't even realize they're doing it, but don't really create a place where everybody's voice is being heard.
I felt that Kathleen addressed this really beautifully this morning. There is always this group. There often are various groups in a meeting who are friendship groups, who are people who tend to think similarly about the issues the meeting is dealing with and reinforce one another. And sometimes it's a good thing. A lot of writing about what you do when a meeting is stuck on a subject is to let it rest for a while, and those informal conversations tend to get it sorted out a little bit. But Kathleen this morning talked about inclusion and looking around to see who is that influential in group and who are the people who may experience themselves as more marginal? And how do you make a balance between drawing in, between hearing those weighty friends who have often a lot of good experience and good things to share, and drawing in the people who have an outlying position that might in fact be very useful to the meeting and useful to the sense of community. And sometimes even acknowledging to one of your weighty friends, you know, Joe, you carry a lot of weight in the meeting, and we have to listen here to the people who see it differently, who haven't been in the meeting as long and don't have all the experience. Sometimes you just need to ask the weighty ones to step back.
So
One or
my
two
question
other-
had more to do with people that not speaking up within meeting for worship for business, but making decisions or just doing things in the background. Do you just wait it out? Do you look for a pattern? You know, do you name the behavior? You know, what do friends do if
Well,
if-
let me ask you another question about that then. In terms of, are you talking about things that just mysteriously get done? How did that room get painted that color?
No, I'll give you a kind of a an example that doesn't sound too serious, but it's a good example. The way music had been done in our meeting for a long time is a few people tend to just pick songs and they tend to lead them and they tend to do it a certain way. And as more new people come, some people have, you know, different experiences. Some have classical training, some come from the folk experience, some love it that anyone's singing, and some want to be, you know, more involved in singing. Anyway, there's a lot of really good gifts and really good energy. And I'm looking for ways, like new ways to let those folks be heard, the new people, the people that have ideas of doing things differently. And I've been sitting in meeting, you know, even where someone called a hymn, started a hymn that wasn't, you know, in the group that regularly does it, and someone started singing it, you know, not very well, which, you know, a lot of times we don't sing very well, but we're singing, you know, and this is spirit and we're praising. The person was stopped, you know, more than once. And, you know, we don't really know that song. Let's not do that now, you know, and so that's an example of where new voices are not being listened to. And as clerk, it weighs heavy on my heart, particularly when someone is singing, you know, that they would be silenced. You know, it's not just me. People have come up to me afterwards and, you know, and kind of laid that, you know, at my feet to help with it. And I'm not sure what else to do.
Again, I would cite Kathleen from this morning and then open it up for one or two other people to comment. Kathleen spoke of situations where you can just, how did she put it? You can ignore it, which you've been doing, kind of see if it corrects itself, and then it doesn't, so then you can't ignore it anymore. You can be indirect. That is, you could talk privately with the group who have felt responsible for the music over time, and tell them about your concern and ask them for their ideas of how to open it up. That would be, I believe, what Kathleen meant by indirect. You can be direct, and in a meeting for business or even at a singing time, say, I'm uncomfortable and I think we need to talk about how we do this. So I've been in a couple of meetings where there was a big new rush of new people into the meeting, and there were the people who'd been holding the container for a long time. And it's hard to those people who've been so carefully holding the meeting in love to open their fingers a little bit. Other comments too on Amy's question of people who are stuck with doing it the old way, whatever way that might be. Let's see who's got their hand up. Kate Campbell, is that on this subject?
Yes, kind of. What I've recognized in the last 2 years is the organic conversations that would arise from when we have something we call eating meeting once a month, potluck. We are not getting those organic, small, informal discussions, and I think some people may feel very alone. They may have feelings, but they haven't had an opportunity to bounce those off people in an informal way, and they're uncomfortable raising them in a formal way. So I think it's the circumstances that we're in right now is people feeling kind of marginalized because they either don't know or don't believe that anybody else has the same feelings they do. I don't think I articulated that very well, but it's something that I've felt. And when you're trying to bring new people in, they would go doubly for them.
Thanks for that. Moon?
Unmuted. Hi, Pat. I was just thinking, you could do what most meetings do and form a committee and make sure that it's balanced out with the old way of doing music and the new people, and see how that works out.
Okay, one or two other comments of things that are hard for people in your meeting to get about being well behaved. Moon, you had more to say on the subject?
Well, it's a one-word issue that is like the red flag at our meeting now, and that's money.
Mm-hmm. So there are specific topics that provoke our worst behaviors, or there are topics where they're not weighty enough. It gets proposed that we do X, you don't care about X, you say I approve, and the meeting moves on. But there are a few topics, some particular to a meeting and some fairly generic, like money and property, where people have deep and strong feelings. And that's when we really need to dig down and remember our good manners. Zachary, can you show us our list again, or did I accidentally turn it off? What did I do here? There's our list. And then scroll through it from the top, please. There we go. So you have now taught a class on what we should be doing in a meeting for work business. We should prepare ourselves both with the information, but to have ourselves be grounded. That if we're working in Zoom, that we help people be comfortable with the technology. Ask a question when it's in your heart. Be ready to give up your continue to defend your point. Come with a mindset to support the clerk. Listen deeply. And we've identified some places where it's particularly hard. It's hard when the business is complex. It's hard when we've been, when our meeting houses don't lend themselves to the current circumstances. It's hard. It's hard when people aren't so familiar with the roles of who's the leader and who's the follower here. It's hard when things happen off scene, and how do you bring them into focus if they're problematic? So what I'm going to propose that we do next, or well, next after a little bit of a break, is talk about how we educate our meetings. It got started this morning. Wanda brought it up to Kathleen of how do you introduce this to our meetings? What I'd like to do now, and asking Zachary once again to have his magical pretend flip chart going, is to think about how, when, and where we can teach our communities to participate more fully, more skillfully, more groundedly in our meetings for business. So I'm going to invite people to raise your hand to tell us of in what context, for example, have an adult class, have a formal class, the whole meeting's invited to it, and you teach them about the kinds of things we've been talking about today. So that's one example. What are other ways we can help introduce to our meeting members how to more fully and richly participate in the meeting for business? You notice I'm making you all do all the work today. Gwen.
There's a great Pendle Hill pamphlet called Beyond Consensus, Salvaging Sense of the Meeting that we're, Karen Council is offering to people to read, and we'll hold a discussion for those who are interested.
So suggesting kind of having a book club on the subject of meeting for business. Read it, we'll get together.
One time, yeah, one time with that pamphlet.
A one-time book club, okay? Excellent. Wanda.
Something I learned today that I just want to make sure that everyone heard was having a query at the beginning of meeting for business about one of the issues or one of the topics within this.
So one of the skills or pieces of knowledge that we hope people will bring can be lifted up, just one of them, at the beginning of a meeting for business. Excellent, thank you. Nancy.
I think change can also begin in committee meetings, where if we encourage conversation and then also encourage that if it's necessary to speak about this at a business meeting, that we've now had a conversation and maybe we can bring something up at a business meeting or contribute to a business meeting if we need to.
Thank you, Nancy. Drew?
My thought was kind of simple. It's when members come to meeting, first of all, I think the most important thing is that they remember it is a meeting for worship first. And I think the best way we can show that is for seasoned members to set good examples. Folks, in our last business meeting, several seasoned members reached out and helped me as clerk get out of some difficult situations. So if the clerk is having a problem, it's a good way for others who can help to help and set good examples and show that there's ways to disagree pleasantly and effectively.
I want to reinforce that when I have this clear memory, I forget the woman's name. Some people here are going to remember her. When I was new to Quakerism and attending meeting for business at Arch Street, when there might be 500 of us in the room and 50 of us misbehaving, this woman, who I think was on the faculty at Westtown and was an older person, would stand up and just in a calm voice remind us what we were there to do. And you could just sort of feel the meeting come in. So that's something that those who are more seasoned and more grounded, not necessarily older, have the opportunity to do to bail the clerk out, to bail the meeting out. Cheryl.
I just love this faithfully participating in meeting decision-making piece that you sent around. And I'm going to send it around to my meeting. We have a Google group and I'm going to send it around to them just to share it because, you know, we don't get enough stuff like this on a regular basis.
So just circulate it. Carol.
Yeah, one of the things that I've done as in my life as a manager is I never sort of say, do this, don't do that, or get didactic in that way. Instead, I always refer to the reasoning behind it. And I may, you know, ask people who are acting a certain way in meeting, how is this helping us get to the heart of the spirit? Or how would you like us to use that information to come to help us come to consensus about the leading of the spirit? Use those sort of questions that point to what it is we're supposed to be doing without saying, hey, you're not doing it.
Good point. People just don't take well to being told that they're totally wrong. But there are ways to do it. Joan.
Oh, yes. One of the things that I just started last month as a clerk is at the end of meeting for business to ask generative questions. And questions that, like we have an issue with declining in membership. And one of the questions was, what do we feel is the reason for that? But also when you ask a generative question, you should ask a positive one. And my next question was, why do we remain members of this meeting? And it brought, I think, great joy. And generative questions are not questions that need to be answered or debated. They're just ideas.
Thank you. I did a little brainstorming of myself, of my own preparing for the meeting, and there's just a couple left on my list that haven't popped up. One is the newsletter. If your meeting has a newsletter, you can put in a whole article or 1 point or 1 point every issue about meeting for worship or meeting for business to gently educate the meeting. Nancy spoke about working through committees, and my meeting has a regular clerks meeting. So all the committee clerks get together with the clerk of the meeting. I don't know how often that happens. I don't think it's every month. I haven't been a clerk in this meeting yet. Educating the clerks. You know, you could give over a clerks meeting to doing some of the things that we've done today. Let's see, I've got another hand. James?
I guess Friends Meeting of Austin, we've been doing Quakerism 101 almost every year now. And of course, that's mostly sort of geared towards newer people in the meeting. But it's turned out actually a lot of people who have attended the meeting for a long time or have been members for a long time are also really eager to go to those sessions. And so one of those each year, of course, is Getting Down to Business, which describes the practice of business meeting. So it's sort of a dual purpose for us, that it helps to introduce this to new people, and it also just gives space for people at the meeting who maybe have been there for a long time to reflect on those practices.
thank you for this really wonderful list of things, which will be circulated to you after today, because all of these venues are available. I mean, maybe not every single one in your meeting is available, but it gives you space to start thinking about what could you do in your meeting to help people know. I have to tell you, it's not about the meeting for business, but it's about the meeting for worship. That we had a workshop, but similar to this in our meeting, and Bill Tabor was our speaker, and he's talking about the meeting for worship. I'd been a friend at that point for 25 years. And he mentioned something that had never, ever occurred to me. I never thought of it. It just wasn't in my mind. And it was an essential part of being a good participant in the meeting for worship, which is to the people who are holding the meeting in the light, who are maybe rarely speak, but are holding the meeting in light and love. It never occurred to me that that was there to do.
Yeah.
So as James spoke about his meeting and the longer time members going to the Quakerism 101, as we're learning, we miss pieces. We just do, and can continue to learn. Elaine.
Just a thought on preparing for meeting. Sometimes it's easier to listen than it is to sit down and read. So if you have the option of somebody recording, audio recording of some, at least the synopsis, beginning and the end of lengthy documents, that person who's driving in their car or doing other things around the house can listen and get an idea of what's going on. And then if that's something they're really interested in, they'll make the time to go listen to it. Just a thought.
I love that outside the box thought. Now I want to direct us to a nuanced part of this. We've been talking about big picture things we can do. I'd like us to talk now for a while. Back to the flip chart there, Zachary, new section, about what you can do in the moment when you're clerking. So the meeting's cooking along, and then it's not cooking along so well. People are defending their point of view, or it's becoming acrimonious, or you're just not coming to unity, or one of the other 500 things that can go not quite right in a meeting for business. What can a clerk do in the moment to clerk and the seasoned friends for that matter, but we're talking about clerking right now. What can the clerk do to kind of right the ship in the midst of a meeting for business? What are some things that interventions the clerk might make? Thank you, Zachary, for fixing that letter.
You're welcome.
Or the other way too. Margaret, what are some things the clerk might do?
Asking for everybody to settle back into worship, to give it some space.
And something I learned about when is the right time for the clerk to ask the meeting to settle. It's when the clerk feels unsettled. Jan?
Sometimes it helps to stop the general talk and just say, okay, what is the sense of the meeting right now? Do we have a sense of the meeting? Or, kind of bring it down and have people encapsulate what's happened.
Or for the clerk to test the sense of the meeting. It seems to me that we're leaning toward this course of action. And that often brings out the clarity in the people who go, well, I'm not down that path. it opens, it doesn't close it. If you don't say, and now who approves, if you open it, say, I want to test this as the sense, to know how many people are easy with it, and if there are people who are not easy with it, and it can open things up. Let's see, who do we have? Phil. What can a clerk do?
Generalize what they just said. Sometimes it helps to name what's going on. Very often when we get into contention, what's being verbalized is not the issue. And if the clerk can dig deep to what the real issues are, that can transform the meeting.
I think I'm going to ask you, Phil, to give an example.
Oh, let's see. A couple of times during the called meeting on racism of yearly meeting that I mentioned a while back, people started ranting, accusing one another. The clerk named that there was an issue of their own anger, which was valid anger, but it wasn't what was being expressed. Does that help?
Yes, thank you. Naming anger in a Quaker meeting is a fascinating thing to do because we like to pretend we don't have it.
I think it also, anger is one thing, but bad interpersonal relationships is another. Person A may oppose person B, not because of what person B said, but because the two people don't get along.
Exactly.
And that's another case where the clerk can say, hey, two of you go have a fist fight outside, and we'll go on with meeting for business. Or something gentler than that. I personally like quarter sticks of dynamite, but others have different techniques.
Okay, one or two more things, interventions a clerk might do during meetings for business. Agnes?
Yes, I look at body language because I often see that there'll be somebody looking troubled, but they're not saying anything. And then I invite them to speak.
Yes, I've been known to look at somebody and say, Agnes, you're looking troubled. And I get this startled response like, what, are you reading my mind or something? And then they go, well, actually, I wasn't going to say this, but here we go. Pam.
When I've clerked, I sometimes, and I'm having trouble with the sense of what the sense of the meeting might be, I sometimes just ask for help from the gathered group and say, I am not sensing this. Can any of you help me out with whether we have a sense of the meeting or what it might be?
And I have seen some brilliant answers from the floor from somebody who's had the leisure to be thinking about it. I mean, the clerk, one presiding, has to be very focused. And yeah, it's a great thing to try. I know that there's a couple more hands, but I'm going to suggest that we move along. because I want us to go to a section of our time together, which I have titled When the Going Gets Tough. So, various things have been brought up. Some of us were inspired to come to this meeting because our meetings are in some kind of conflict around an issue that's not getting solved. And from time to time in the life of nearly every meeting, such an issue comes up. It could be a difficult question. It could be difficult personalities. It could be calming differences or reconciling the meeting after there has been a bruising process. It got resolved. The meeting took action. Whatever it's doing, it's doing. But there's still some people who feel hurt that they weren't adequately heard, or otherwise hurt that this proposal that I brought forward that was eventually adopted was treated so roughly. We could make this the theme of the whole day, right? And still have some left over to talk about. So we'll try and make good use of the next 20 minutes or so. I want you to take a minute and center yourself and think about either a difficult occasion, current or past, or a friend whom you find particularly difficult to deal with. Just bring that person to mind or that circumstance to mind. Now tune into your feelings when you think about this situation. Your frustration or your fear or your sense of helplessness. What are your feelings about this situation? What rises up in your body? Now open yourself up to guidance and see what comes up for you as a way to hold this situation or this person in love and light. Now bringing your attention back to the group and recognizing that that was a very short time and a short exercise. I'm just curious whether even that little bit provided you an opportunity to kind of soften a little around the issue. How many people found that it did? So that's a good fair portion of us. And it lets us know, I mean, that you could do that exercise when you call the meeting, let's take a moment of silence. You could walk yourself through that, giving yourself back to the spirit, remembering that you don't have to be afraid. And holding that difficulty in light and love. Part of it is to remove yourself from a sense of conflict, that you're trying to get something done in this meeting and that person or that group of difficult people are making it hard. If the situation is chronic, you can do a practice such as this between meetings, or as part of your preparation for a meeting for business where you know there's a challenging item on the agenda. When I'm preparing to clerk a meeting and I think there's something challenging, I mean, sometimes you're surprised the challenge comes up. You never thought that would have brought up such a conflict. But when you know it's coming, I like to think about how it might go. X might happen, Y might happen, and what will I do if that happens? Well, what will I do if that happens? Well, what will I do if that happens? To be a little prepared for what might come out and not caught flat-footed. Now I'd like you to take a few minutes and think about an intractable situation, one that's active in your meeting right now, or one that you've survived, but you look back on and think we might have handled it differently. And we're just going to take some time to think about, for each person to take their situation and begin to develop a plan. When I get home and before the next meeting, here's what I'm going to try to do. That does assume that all meetings have intractable situations, and if you're in a meeting that does not, hold the rest of us in the light. So begin to make a plan for how you will deal with this difficult situation, looking back over this morning and this afternoon's conversation. And if your meeting's in a good place right now, consider how you can further deepen the meeting's groundedness for the next time something hard comes up.